Harold came back on a rusted train that seemed just as exhausted as he was. The metal rattled beneath his feet, as if trying to remind him that he was standing on solid ground again, even though his mind was still trapped in the damp fields of Europe. When the train finally stopped at the small station of his hometown, Harold remained seated for a few more seconds, staring out the window, watching people step off into the arms of waiting loved ones. There were hugs, tears, laughter. He had none. Of that, no one was waiting for him, only his worn-out military bag, with a broken strap and a corner still smeared with months-old dried mud. He stood up slowly, as if every joint in his body were a door that hadn't been opened in years. His right hand trembled uncontrollably, a constant reminder of everything he could never erase. As he stepped down, the cold struck his face. It was a different cold than Europe's, drier, but it still seeped into his bones, as if trying to anchor him to a life he no longer belonged to. The platform was almost empty. A couple of merchants unloaded crates without giving him a single glance. An elderly woman waited for her grandson, who ran into her arms the moment he spotted her. Harold watched the scene with a strange mixture of tenderness and pain. Once upon a time, someone had waited for him too, but that was before the world broke, before he broke with it. He walked toward the exit without hurry, dragging his battered boots that still carried dust from a country he no longer wanted to remember. Each step echoed hollowly, as though the town itself did not want to hear him return. At the main street, he stopped. Everything looked the same, and yet completely different. The lampposts that once glowed warmly now seemed cold and distant. The house fronts held their old colors, but something about them felt dim, as if the war had cast a shadow even on those who never witnessed it. He scanned the faces passing by, hoping to recognize someone. No one noticed him. No one greeted him. Not because they didn't care, but because they didn't recognize him. The cheerful young man who left for the front no longer existed, and the silent man who had returned, with haunted eyes and invisible but deep scars, looked nothing like him. They didn't know it was Harold, and maybe he thought it didn't matter. He kept walking, passing the old barber shop where his father used to take him as a boy. His father was gone. The house he grew up in had been sold. His childhood friends had married, moved away, or simply forgotten him. Who could blame them? No one waits forever for a ghost. A gust of wind swept through, lifting dried leaves and tugging at the lapel of his faded green military jacket. He pulled the collar tighter around his neck, trying to protect himself from the cold. But deep down, he knew that what truly froze him wasn't the weather, but the loneliness. That hollow feeling of returning to a place that no longer felt like home. He caught sight of his reflection in a shop window and stopped. He barely recognized the man staring back. His eyes, once full of life, were now two dark wells looking inward, searching for something that no longer existed. His overgrown beard, the deep lines carved by sleepless nights, the slouched posture of someone still carrying an invisible rifle. He was a soldier without a war, a traveler without a destination. With his trembling hand gripping the handle of his bag, Harold took a long breath. He didn't know what he would do next. He had no family, no money, no plan, only a body that refused to collapse and a soul begging for silence. He had returned, but he had nothing. And without knowing it, he was about to cross paths with someone who would change everything. Harold walked for nearly an hour with no clear direction, following the town streets like someone wandering through someone else's memory. His stomach growled with an almost painful intensity. It had been more than a day since he'd eaten anything warm. He had survived on military rations for years, but even those felt like a luxury compared to what he had now. Nothing. As he continued forward, the smell of freshly baked bread captured him unexpectedly. It drifted from a small corner grocery store, a modest place with a slightly crooked wooden sign that read, Eleanor's Market. The scent hit him with a sharp ache. It was a homely, almost maternal smell, and for a moment, Harold felt that if he kept walking past it, he might never feel anything like that again. His boots guided him, almost without his conscious decision. When he opened the door, a small bell chimed softly, a gentle sound that contrasted with the explosions that had shaped his recent life. Inside, the shop was warm, lit by yellowish lamps and filled with shelves of fresh food. an unexpected refuge. Harold approached the counter with hesitant steps. Behind it, a woman in her 60s was arranging cans. Her silver hair was pulled back into a low bun, and her serene face carried small wrinkles that spoke more of kindness than age. She looked up, observing him with a quiet curiosity, as if she had seen similar wounds before in other people. "Good afternoon," she said, her voice so gentle that for a moment Harold felt his entire body loosen. He nodded silently. His eyes moved across the display. There was hot soup, fresh bread, meat pie. Everything looked far too luxurious for someone like him. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his last bill. It was so wrinkled it looked as if it had been through the war with him. He placed it on the counter, his hand trembling involuntarily. "Just whatever this can get me," he muttered, ashamed. The woman picked up the bill without comment and discreetly examined his clothes. The faded green military jacket, the worn buttons, the hands stained by the weight of things no human should bear. She looked at the bill again. It wasn't enough for even a small meal. She already knew that. But she also knew that this man was not asking for charity. He was asking for dignity. Eleanor, though he didn't yet know her name, smiled softly. "Today we have a special promotion," she said, as if it were an ordinary statement. A hot meal with bread included. Before Harold could protest, she was already serving him steaming soup and slicing a piece of soft bread. He opened his mouth to object, but the firm, gentle look on her face stopped him. He felt that if he rejected this gesture, something inside him that was barely holding on would break. He sat at a small table by the window. When he took the first spoonful, the warmth traveled down his throat like a caress he didn't know he needed. It was the first time in a long while that something didn't taste like fear, metal, or cold, wet earth. Harold lowered his gaze so no one would see the silent tears filling his eyes. The woman continued attending the store, but every so often she glanced his way, not with pity, but with a deep kind of recognition. The recognition of someone who knows what it's like to lose everything. As Harold ate, an unfamiliar sensation began to rise within him, a mix of relief and vulnerability. He had spent his last bill, but for the first time since returning, he felt that maybe he hadn't reached the end after all. What he didn't know was that this simple bowl of soup would be the first thread in a destiny that was about to change. Eleanor had always been observant. It was a skill she developed not out of curiosity but out of necessity. Living alone for so many years had turned her into a woman who could read silences, who could interpret the way people breathed when they were sad, tired, or afraid. And that man, the veteran in the faded green jacket with storm-filled eyes, wasn't just tired, he was broken on the inside. While Harold ate, she moved boxes, wiped the counter, and greeted the few customers who came in, but her attention returned to him again and again. There was something in his posture, in the way he held the spoon as if it were heavier than it really was. Something in the way he kept his shoulders hunched, not from the cold, but from the learned instinct to protect himself from the world. Eleanor had seen many men return from the war, but few carried the kind of silence Harold bore. Most talked, needed to unload, to explain, to tell everything. But not him. He seemed to swallow his pain the way someone gets used to drinking poison in small doses. At one moment, he lifted his gaze, maybe out of reflex, maybe just to orient himself. And that was when she truly saw him for the first time. Those few seconds, that brief meeting of eyes, made Eleanor understand something she could not put into words. This man needed help. Not charity, not pity, real help. Harold quickly noticed she was watching him and lowered his eyes immediately. He was used to hiding, to not being seen. At the front, being seen meant being a target. In civilian life, being seen meant questions he didn't want to answer. But Eleanor's gaze wasn't probing. It was gentle, human, almost maternal, and that disarmed him more than any enemy weapon ever could. Wanting to approach without intruding, Eleanor took a cup of hot tea and brought it to his table. "To go with the soup," she said in that same calm voice that seemed to wrap around him like a blanket. Harold looked at her, surprised, as if the gesture were too big for a man who felt so small in that moment. "I don't want to," "Take advantage," he murmured. "You're not," she replied. "Here, we all need something at some time." A deep, almost dense silence settled between them. But it was a different kind of silence than the one Harold carried. It was a silence that didn't demand explanations or memories, a silence that simply allowed him to exist. Eleanor returned to the counter, but before she walked away, she rested a hand on the back of Harold's chair. A brief touch, without hurry or intention, except to remind him of something. That he was still human, that he still deserved to be treated with dignity. Harold stared at his cup of tea for several seconds. No one had touched him like that in years. No one had spoken to him with that mixture of respect and tenderness since he left his home. Something in his chest, which had been rigid for so long, began to loosen slowly, like a rope that had been pulled too tight for far too long. Eleanor continued glancing at him when he wasn't looking. And for the first time, she noticed a detail that moved her deeply. Harold held the cup with both hands, not to drink but to feel its warmth, as if he needed to make sure that something, even an object, could still offer him warmth. The shop stayed quiet for several minutes. Outside, the icy wind kept blowing, moving dry leaves along the street. But inside, a different energy was forming. Something small, almost invisible, but undeniably real. A bond beginning to take shape without either of them naming it. Eleanor still knew nothing about Harold. She didn't know his name, his past, or his wounds. But she knew one thing with absolute certainty. This man was standing on the edge of disappearing inside himself, and she wasn't going to let him. Eleanor wasn't the kind of woman who made impulsive decisions. She was practical, shaped by years of quiet responsibility. Her life revolved around opening the store, helping the neighbors, checking inventory, and closing at dusk. Nothing extraordinary, nothing that ever shook her routine. But something about Harold, something deep, fragile, and silent, had touched a part of her that hadn't been stirred in decades. As he finished his soup, she pretended to sort boxes in the back room, though her mind was consumed by a single question that wouldn't stop circling. Where would this man spend the night? Winter was unforgiving. The temperature dropped more with each passing hour, and Harold only had a worn-out military jacket and a trembling body that wouldn't withstand the cold for long. Eleanor knew how to recognize someone on the edge of collapse, and Harold was dangerously close. Standing by the half-open door to the back room, she watched him without drawing attention. She saw him sip the last of his soup, as if he didn't want something good to end. She saw him cling to the cup of tea just to keep his hands warm. She saw him look out the window at the street with a mix of fear and resignation, like a man who had nowhere to go and no one to call. That was the exact moment Eleanor felt a pang in her chest. Not pity, recognition, the memory of her own past. She had known the brutal loneliness of not knowing whether there would be a roof or a plate of food the next day. Life had hit her hard, and someone at some point had reached out a hand without expecting anything in return. Maybe, she thought, now it was her turn to give that back. She took a quiet breath, then walked toward Harold with firm steps, even though her heart was racing with the weight of the decision she was about to make. He looked up the moment he sensed her presence. "Feeling better?" she asked, her voice so soft it seemed to carry years of untold stories. Harold nodded, uncomfortable with receiving so much attention. "Yes, ma'am, thank you for the meal." She tilted her head, studying him. Now she could clearly see the exhaustion in his skin, the way his eyes seemed to be searching for a safe place to rest, even for just a moment. And that was when something inside her settled into certainty. "Do you have somewhere to stay tonight?" she asked plainly. Harold tensed immediately. The question stripped him bare. "I'm fine," he replied automatically, the way a soldier tries to maintain dignity even when he no longer has the strength to hold it up. Eleanor didn't believe a word. She sighed softly and placed her hands on the table. "Listen," she said with steady resolve. "Upstairs, above this store, there's a small room. Nothing fancy. Just a bed, a table, an old stove. No one uses it. If you need a place to sleep tonight, it's available." Harold's eyes widened. For a second, he looked like a lost child who'd found refuge. But then he lowered his gaze again. "I don't want to be a burden," he murmured, barely audible. You wouldn't be, she replied firmly. Sometimes people just need a moment to rest so they can keep going. You need that, and I have the space. There's nothing else to discuss. Harold swallowed hard. No one had spoken to him that way in years. No one had offered him something without expecting something in return. He stayed silent for a long moment, as if deciding whether to keep rejecting help or allow, for the first time in a long while, someone to treat him with humanity. Finally, he looked up. His eyes were red, but there was something else in them. Relief. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice trembling more than his hand. Eleanor smiled. She had made an impulsive decision. Yes, but for the first time in many years she felt she had done exactly what needed to be done. And without knowing it, that decision would change both of their lives. That night, after closing the store, Eleanor led Harold to the small room she had mentioned. They climbed a narrow staircase where each step creaked, as if recounting the shop's long history. At the top, she opened the door and turned on a small lamp. The room was humble but warm. A wooden bed, a small table, a chair, an old rusty stove, and a window that allowed a faint street lantern to spill soft light inside. Harold stood in the doorway, motionless, as if he were afraid to touch anything and break it. Or perhaps he feared that, by accepting it, he would realize he didn't deserve such a human gesture. "It's not much," Eleanor said, "but it's yours for tonight. You can stay longer if you need to." Harold nodded, though he seemed to be processing more than her words. She placed an extra blanket on the bed and started heading back, downstairs. That's when she heard his voice. "Mum," he said, the word fragile, trembling on his tongue. Eleanor turned around. Harold stood beside the bed, his back straight but his shoulders shaking. His eyes flickered between gratitude and fear. "You don't have to stay and talk," he continued, almost ashamed. "I just wanted to say thank you." Eleanor took a few steps toward him, not too close, but enough to let him know she was truly listening. "Harold," she said, using his name for the first time. "You're not obligated to thank me. Sometimes people just need a safe place, and sometimes if we have one, we must offer it." Harold took a long breath, as if her words had opened a gate inside him. He sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor. "I don't remember the last time someone spoke to me like that," he whispered. Eleanor sat on the chair beside the table, waiting. She didn't insist. She didn't ask questions. She let the silence invite him, not pressure him. And that simple patience was enough for Harold, for the first time in a long while, to feel he could speak. "I wasn't ready to come back," he began, his voice trembling. "But the war didn't want to leave me either." Eleanor's gaze remained steady, free of judgment. "There are nights," Harold continued, "when I hear things that aren't there anymore. Footsteps, screams, explosions. And the worst part," he swallowed hard, trying to maintain control, "the worst part is that I got used to it, to the noise, to the fear, to not sleeping. And now that I'm here," he looked around the room, "the silence hurts more than anything else." The words came out like fragments from a body trying to piece itself back together. Eleanor didn't interrupt. She knew that a single interruption could make him close the door he was finally opening. "I lost so many friends," he said. "People who talked to me the night before and were gone the next morning. I learned not to ask, not to cry, not to remember names. And now," he covered his face with one hand, "now I don't know how to be a person again." Eleanor felt a knot tighten in her throat. Her instinct was to move closer, but she held back. She knew that even the kindest gesture could overwhelm someone at the edge. Instead, she spoke softly. "You don't have to be perfect tonight. You just have to rest." Harold lifted his gaze to her. Tears gathered in his eyes but didn't fall, held back by years of pride and survival. "What if I can't?" he asked, voice trembling. Eleanor smiled gently, like someone speaking to a child who has had too long a day. "Then tomorrow you try again." For the first time, Harold released a breath that sounded like relief, as if he had let go of an invisible pack he had carried for far too long. He lay back slowly on the bed while Eleanor rose to leave. "Good night, Harold," she said. "Good night." "And thank you," he replied. When the door closed, Harold stared at the ceiling. The silence was still there, yes. But for the first time in years, it no longer felt like his enemy. It felt like a beginning. The next morning, Harold woke up long before the store's opening bell. He wasn't used to sleeping in a soft bed. For years, he had learned to rest on his backpack, on cold ground, or in noisy barracks where silence was a luxury. But that night, although he didn't sleep deeply, he rested. And that was something he hadn't felt in a very long time. He got up slowly, as if his body was still afraid of fully relaxing. He opened the window slightly. The cold morning air entered and reminded him he was still alive. He washed his face with the water in the pitcher Eleanor had left, and when he went downstairs, he found her arranging boxes of fresh fruit on the counter. "Good morning, Harold," she said with a soft but firm smile. "Did you sleep well?" He hesitated for a moment, as if admitting something good made him too vulnerable. "Better than I have in many years," he finally said. Eleanor nodded, pleased. There was something in him, a mix of fragility and strength, that awakened a protective instinct she thought she'd lost long ago. As she placed apples into a basket, Eleanor noticed Harold standing there, unsure of what to do. His posture was rigid, almost military, as if he were waiting for orders again. "Harold," she said, breaking the silence, "I'm going to be direct. I need help here in the store. Someone who can move boxes, organize the stockroom, help with deliveries. It's not much, but it's honest work." Harold blinked, surprised. "I don't want you to think I'm taking advantage of your hospitality." Something different on his face. "I don't think that." "Not happiness," she replied, "not exactly. Firm but kind. It was something smaller, and if I wanted to offer you charity, I'd tell you. But this is something different." "How did it go?" she asked. "You need a purpose, and I need an extra pair of hands." But his eyes held a faint spark. That last sentence struck him harder than he expected. She said, "A purpose." She said, "It's good to have me back in town." What that felt like. Eleanor smiled, unable to hide her emotion. His gaze. "Because it is uncomfortable." Those simple, sincere words lingered in the air long after they both returned to work. Betrayed his uncertainty. Harold didn't know it yet, but day by day, I can try, he said at last. Gesture by gesture, Eleanor smiled. Glance by glance. "That's enough." Life was Without wasting time, she showed him the stockroom, a space full of boxes, cans, sacks of rice and flour stacked from the floor nearly to the ceiling. It was an organized chaos, but chaos nonetheless. Eleanor knew that Harold, with his military discipline, could bring order to that small world. "First, help me move these boxes to the back," she said, pointing at several that seemed far too heavy for someone her age. Harold didn't hesitate. He bent down, grabbed the first box and lifted it with more ease than he expected. His body, though weakened, still remembered the strength required to survive. But this box weighed differently. It wasn't ammunition. It wasn't a wounded comrade. It wasn't equipment that determined life or death. It was just a box of oranges. And for the first time in a long while, that normalcy felt almost sacred. As they worked together, Eleanor watched him from the corner of her eye. She noticed how Harold paused before each movement, as if scanning the terrain, as if expecting something to explode at any moment. He was a man still living in constant alert. "You can breathe, you know," she said with a smile. Harold looked at her, confused. "There's no danger here." He swallowed, unsure how to respond. She was right, but his body didn't believe it yet. After an hour, the stockroom began to take shape. Harold organized everything with almost surgical precision. Every box, every sack, every jar had a specific place. Eleanor was impressed. "You're good at this," she said. He shook his head. "I just follow orders." "No," she insisted gently. "You're doing something well, and that matters." Harold felt a strange warmth in his chest, not physical, emotional, a faint, nearly forgotten sensation, the feeling of being useful. When they finished, Eleanor handed him a cup of coffee. "Welcome to your first day of work, Harold." He held the cup with both hands. The warmth traveled across his palms like a promise. "Thank you, truly." Eleanor looked at him with tenderness. "Don't thank me yet. Tomorrow will be harder." He smiled. A small smile. Clumsy, but real. And in that smile, Eleanor understood that something inside him had begun to heal. As the days passed, Harold slowly became part of the store's landscape. He wasn't just another employee. He was a quiet presence who worked with almost ritualistic dedication. Every morning he came, downstairs before Eleanor, swept the entrance, organized the shelves, and prepared the stockroom as if it were a barracks that needed to remain immaculate for survival. Customers saw him walking through the aisles, always in his faded green jacket and with trembling yet steady hands. Some whispered, others watched him with curiosity. There were those who offered shy smiles, recognizing him as the soldier who once left the town with courage. Others avoided meeting his eyes, as if afraid that the man carrying so many dark memories would see too deeply into them. But Eleanor observed him differently. She noticed every small change, the way Harold breathed with a little less rigidity, the way his steps began losing their cautious edge, the way his gaze, though still shadowed, started opening just a bit more to the world around him. It was a slow transformation, a silent one that made no noise but could be felt, like the subtle shift in the air just before spring arrives. One afternoon, a customer accidentally dropped a bag of flour near the counter. The bag burst upon impact, sending a cloud of white dust across the floor. Harold froze. His breathing quickened. The small pop of the bag had echoed in his mind like an explosion. Without saying a word, Eleanor approached him and knelt beside him. She began gathering the spilled flour calmly, as if the moment were nothing unusual. "It's all right, Harold," she said at last, her voice soft yet steady. Nothing happened. Her words were an anchor. Something inside Harold came back to the surface. He took a long breath, then knelt down and helped her. The customer apologized repeatedly, but Eleanor soothed her with the same serenity. "He's all right," she said, looking at Harold with a tenderness that needed no explanation. It took Harold several minutes to return to himself. But he did, and for both of them, that meant more than any task completed in the store. Other days, Eleanor would find him standing at the window for a few seconds, staring at the street without truly seeing it. It was as if his mind wandered into a distant field that no longer existed. She never interrupted him. She simply placed a warm cup of coffee nearby and went back to her work. They didn't need words. Their silence was building something powerful. Trust. One afternoon, while they were arranging boxes in the stockroom, Harold suddenly stopped. "Eleanor," he said without lifting his gaze, "thank you for all of this." She continued working, not wanting to make him feel exposed. "You don't have to thank me," she replied. "We're here to look out for one another. It's always been that way in this town, even if we forget it sometimes." Harold nodded. He knew her words were true, but he also knew that not everyone would have done what she did for him. Most would have let him fade into the background, another invisible shadow. One day, Eleanor sent him to deliver some boxes to a neighbor. When he returned, there was coming back to him, not all at once, but in small lights that together began to illuminate the darkness he had carried for so long, and Eleanor watched that light grow, with patience, with silent love, with the certainty that if things continued this way, Harold would eventually find himself again. It happened on a quiet afternoon, the kind of afternoon where everything seemed predictable, steady, almost peaceful. Harold was in the stockroom, stacking jars on the upper shelves, humming, quietly, a habit he'd begun to develop without even noticing. Eleanor was at the front counter, checking the ledger with her reading glasses slipping down her nose. It was a normal day, ordinary. That's why it struck so deeply when everything changed in an instant. Harold heard it before he saw it, a faint thud followed by the unmistakable sound of something falling to the floor. A jar rolled off the counter and shattered. But what made his heart freeze wasn't the glass. It was the silence that followed. "Eleanor!" he called out. No answer. He rushed out of the stockroom, almost slipping on the flour he had cleaned earlier that day. When he reached the counter, he saw her collapsed on the floor, her body curled slightly toward her chest, her breathing shallow and uneven. Her glasses lay crooked beside her, the ledger open on a page she would never remember writing on. "Eleanor!" Harold's voice cracked, not with panic, but with something deeper, fear. A fear he thought he had exhausted. In the war, yet here it was again, sharp and merciless. He knelt beside her, gently lifting her head. Her skin was cold, far too cold. "Stay with me," he murmured, his voice trembling. "Please, Eleanor, stay with me." For a moment she didn't respond. Harold felt his chest tighten, the same way it had tightened the night he held a friend in the trenches, trying to keep him awake. The memory slammed into him with brutal force, the cold, the helplessness, the weight of another person's life in his hands. But this time he refused to let history repeat itself. He gathered her into his arms, carefully but with surprising strength, and carried her out of the store. The cold air hit him as he stepped outside, but he didn't stop. He walked straight to the old truck parked nearby, opened the passenger door with one hand and placed her inside with all the tenderness he could muster. Her breathing was faint, but present. "Good," he whispered. Just hold on." He climbed into the driver's seat, slammed the door shut and turned the key. The engine coughed, sputtered, and then roared to life. Harold gripped the wheel, his knuckles white, and pressed the accelerator. The hospital wasn't far, but every second felt like an hour. He kept glancing sideways, watching Eleanor's chest rise and fall, terrified of the moment it might stop. The world outside blurred. Houses, trees, people, everything reduced to a smear of color as he drove faster than he ever had. When he reached the hospital, he didn't wait for help. He jumped out of the truck, rushed to Eleanor's side and carried her inside. "Nurse, someone help!" he shouted. Doctors and nurses rushed toward him, guiding him to a stretcher. As they took her from his arms, Harold felt an emptiness he hadn't expected, as if handing her over meant letting go of something more than her weight. He stood there, shaking, watching as they disappeared behind swinging doors. A nurse placed a hand on his arm. "Are you family?" she asked. Harold opened his mouth, but the answer caught in his throat. Family? No, not by blood, not by tradition. But she was the first person in years who saw him, really saw him. The first person who believed he could be more than the scars he carried. And in that moment, standing in the sterile hallway with the smell of disinfectant burning his nose, Harold realized something. He didn't want to lose her. "Not family," he finally whispered. "But she's all I've got." The nurse nodded and led him to a seat. Harold sat down, elbows on his knees, hands clasped together, trembling, but not from fear of the war this time, from fear of a future without her. Harold sat in the hospital hallway for what felt like an eternity. The fluorescent lights hummed above him, the sterile smell clung to his clothes, and every distant footstep of a doctor felt like a heartbeat he couldn't control. He wasn't used to waiting rooms. He was used to acting, to reacting, to doing whatever it took to keep someone alive. But here he was helpless, and the helplessness was suffocating. Every so often, a nurse passed by and offered him a sympathetic glance. One even brought him a cup of water, which he accepted with trembling hands, but couldn't bring himself to drink. His mind raced with every terrible possibility. What if he had been too late? What if she never woke up? What if the only person who had shown him kindness, real kindness, was slipping away? Harold leaned forward, clasping his hands tightly together, elbows on his knees. He whispered a silent plea to whatever force might be listening. "Please, not her. Not the one good thing I have left." After nearly an hour, the doctor finally emerged. Harold stood too quickly, almost stumbling. "She's stable," the doctor said before Harold could speak. "It was a sudden drop in blood pressure. She fainted, but she's responding well now. She'll need rest and monitoring, but she's going to be all right." Harold exhaled so deeply it felt like his body collapsed from the inside. His knees trembled, his chest loosened. Relief washed over him in a wave so powerful it almost brought him to tears. Can I see her?" he asked. The doctor nodded and guided him down the hall. When Harold entered the room, he froze. Eleanor lay in the bed, a blanket pulled up to her chest, her breathing soft and steady. The beeping of the monitor beside her kept a quiet rhythm in the room. She looked smaller somehow, fragile, more human than he had ever seen her. Harold approached slowly, the way one might approach something sacred. He sat in the chair beside her bed and stared at her face, the familiar lines, the silver hair, the gentle expression, even in sleep. He felt his throat tighten. For a moment neither moved. He simply sat there, watching her chest rise and fall. The world outside, with all its noise and demands, faded away. In that small hospital room, time softened. After several minutes, Eleanor's fingers twitched. Her eyes fluttered open. She blinked slowly, adjusting to the light, and when her gaze finally found Harold sitting beside her, her lips formed a faint smile. "You're here," she whispered, her voice weak but warm. "Of course I'm here," Harold replied, his voice steadier than he felt. "I wasn't going anywhere." Eleanor studied his face carefully, the worry still lingering in his eyes, the exhaustion in the curve of his shoulders, the sadness he tried so hard to hide. "You carried me," she murmured. "Didn't you?" Harold looked down, embarrassed. I couldn't just leave you there." "That's what I mean," she said softly. "You didn't leave." He swallowed hard. No one had ever spoken to him like that, not since before the war, not with gratitude, not with tenderness. "Eleanor," he said quietly, "if something had happened to you—" She raised a hand weakly. Harold hesitated before gently placing his own beneath it. "I'm all right," she whispered, squeezing his fingers. "You saved me." Harold felt something inside him break, not painfully, but like a locked door finally opening after years of rust. "I didn't save you," he murmured. "You saved me first." A tear escaped down Eleanor's cheek, not from sadness, but from the weight of understanding. For a moment the room was filled with a silence that didn't hurt, a silence that healed. "Harold," she said softly, "you're not alone." He bowed his head, letting his forehead brush the back of her hand. For the first time since returning from the war, Harold didn't feel like a ghost wandering through a life that no longer wanted him. He felt seen, he felt needed, he felt human again. And at that moment, he knew with absolute certainty, this woman had changed everything. The days after Eleanor's collapse passed gently, like a slow sunrise after a long night. Harold stayed by her side far longer than the hospital staff required. He brought her water, adjusted her pillows, sat in silence when she slept, and listened carefully when she spoke. The nurses whispered among themselves about the gentleman in the green jacket who refused to leave her room unless it was absolutely necessary. Eleanor regained her strength little by little. Her cheeks, once pale, began to warm with color again. Her voice steadied, her smile returned, and through it all Harold remained a constant figure, calm, devoted, almost protective. One morning, after she had been cleared to go home, Harold helped her into the truck. He drove slowly, as if each bump in the road might disturb her. Eleanor watched him from the passenger seat, noticing details she hadn't allowed herself to before, the way he tightened his jaw when he concentrated, the gentleness of his hands on the wheel, the brief flashes of vulnerability that crossed his expression when he thought she wasn't looking. When they arrived at the store, Harold stepped out and rushed to open her door, offering his arm. Eleanor chuckled softly. "You treat me like I'm made of glass," she said. Harold blinked, unsure whether he should apologize or not. "I just don't want anything to happen to you," he replied honestly. Eleanor felt her chest tighten, not with fear but with warmth. Inside the store, everything looked just as she had left it, except for one thing. The place was spotless, perfectly organized. The stockroom, which had once been a maze of boxes, was now arranged with military precision. Every label faced forward, every sack stood upright. Eleanor turned to Harold with raised eyebrows. "You did all this?" Harold nodded, almost embarrassed. "It gave me something to do," he murmured. "Something to focus on." But Eleanor saw much more than that. It was the work of a man trying to rebuild himself. Over the next days, she stayed in the apartment above the shop while she recovered. Harold prepared her meals, carried baskets upstairs, and only left her side when she insisted. They spent evenings in quiet conversation, sometimes talking about the town, other times about simple things like favorite foods or old memories. And sometimes they sat without speaking at all, letting the silence between them say more than words could. One night, as the snow fell softly outside, Harold brought Eleanor a cup of tea. She accepted it and patted the seat beside her. He sat reluctantly, unsure of himself. "Harold," she said gently, "you know you have a home here, don't you?" He looked down at the cup in his hands. "I've never felt like I belonged anywhere," he admitted. "Not since before the war." Eleanor turned to him, her voice soft but unwavering. "You belong here. With us. With me." Those last two words hung in the air like a fragile truth finally spoken. Harold swallowed, his eyes glistening. "I don't know what I'd be without you," he whispered. "You'd still be you," Eleanor replied, "but maybe now you don't have to be alone." Harold exhaled shakily, as if releasing years of weight. He took her hand, carefully, reverently, and for a moment, they simply held on to each other. No grand declarations, no dramatic promises. Just two souls who had found shelter where they least expected it. Outside, the snow continued falling, blanketing the town in quiet white. Inside the small apartment above the store, something far more precious settled quietly. A beginning. Not the beginning of a romance born of desperation, but of a companionship forged through kindness, healing, and the gentle understanding between two people who had rescued each other without even trying. Harold wasn't a ghost anymore. Eleanor wasn't alone anymore. And together they discovered something neither had felt in decades: hope.